I knew something was wrong the moment I saw the survey crew tramping across the back 40 of my property in rural Vermont. But I never imagined it would lead to the most satisfying revenge I've ever pulled off. My name is Barrett, and I've owned this 100-acre plot of land outside of Burlington for 15 years. It's beautiful country with rolling hills, dense forest, and a creek that runs through the eastern section. When I bought the place, it was unincorporated land with no homeowner association, no restrictions, just pure freedom. That changed 5 years ago when a developer bought the adjacent property and built a subdivision called Maple Ridge Estates. Suddenly, I had neighbors. More importantly, I had a homeowner association that seemed to think their jurisdiction extended beyond their little gated community. The woman leading the charge was named Brenda Patterson, a 50-something real estate agent with blonde highlights, designer athleisure wear, and the kind of attitude that made you want to check your property boundaries twice. She became HOA president about 3 years ago, and since then, she'd made it her personal mission to tell me everything that was wrong with how I maintained my land. My grass was too long. My fence was unsightly. My old pickup truck was an eyesore. Never mind that none of my property was actually part of her HOA. I'd ignored most of her complaints, sending polite but firm letters reminding her that I wasn't a member of Maple Ridge Estates and had no obligation to follow their rules. That usually kept her at bay for a few months before she'd find something new to complain about. But this survey crew was something different. I walked down the hill from my house, my boots crunching through the October frost. The crew consisted of 3 people in reflective vests, one of them peering through a theodolite while the others held measuring rods. "Morning," I called out. "Mind telling me what you're doing on my land?" The guy at the theodolite straightened up. He was young, maybe mid-20s, and he looked uncomfortable. "We're doing a survey for the Maple Ridge HOA. They're planning a construction project. On my property." I kept my voice level, but I could feel the anger building. "I don't know about property lines, sir. We just go where we're told." He pulled out a folded map. "They gave us these coordinates." I looked at the map. It clearly showed a section of my land, about an acre near the road that divided my property from the subdivision. "This is definitely my land. You can check with the county assessor's office." The surveyor's face went pale. "I'll call my supervisor." I waited while he made the call, watching the other 2 crew members shuffle their feet nervously. After a brief conversation, he hung up and turned to me. "My supervisor says the HOA provided all the documentation. He's saying we should continue." "Well, you tell your supervisor that if anyone from your crew steps 1 foot further on my property, I'll have the sheriff out here for trespassing. I don't care what documentation the HOA provided." They packed up and left within 15 minutes. That evening, my phone rang. It was Brenda. "Lucas, I understand there was a misunderstanding today with our survey crew." Her voice had that fake sweetness that set my teeth on edge. "No misunderstanding, Brenda. Your crew was on my land without permission." "Well, actually, we have an easement for that section. It was part of the original development agreement when Maple Ridge was built. I'd read every document related to my property when I bought it, and I knew for a fact there was no such easement." "Show me the documentation." "I'll have our lawyer send it over. But Lucas, I really think you should reconsider being so difficult about this. We're planning to build a salt storage facility for winter road maintenance. It would benefit everyone in the area, including you. Your road gets plowed along with ours." "I pay taxes for road maintenance. The town handles that." "The town is terribly inefficient. The HOA has decided to take over winter maintenance for our section of Ridgeway Road, and we need a place to store the salt. That empty acre of yours is perfect." It's close to the road, it's flat, and frankly, you're not using it for anything. The audacity was breathtaking. Brenda, that's my land. You can't just decide to build on it. We'll compensate you, of course. I'm thinking $500 for the use of the space. It's not for sale, not for rent, not for anything. Find somewhere else. Don't be unreasonable, Lucas. This is happening whether you like it or not. We have the legal right. She hung up before I could respond. The next morning, I drove to the county clerk's office in Burlington. I'd dealt with Sarah Hendricks there before when I'd had some boundary questions about the creek. She was in her early 60s, had worked there for 30 years, and knew property law better than most lawyers. "Lucas, good to see you," she said when I walked in. "What brings you by?" I explained the situation. Brenda claims they have an easement, but I've never seen any documentation of it. Sarah pulled up the records on her computer. "Let me check the original deeds and any recorded easements." She clicked through several screens, her brow furrowing. "I'm not seeing anything. When was Maple Ridge developed? 5 years ago. And you've owned your property for 15. She looked up at me. "Then no, there's no way they could have recorded an easement without your signature. Let me check one more thing." More clicking. "Nope, nothing." If Brenda's claiming there's an easement, she's either mistaken or lying. "Can you print me out the documentation showing the current status of my deed and any easements?" "Absolutely." She printed several pages and handed them to me. "Lucas, if they try to build on your land without your permission, that's trespassing at minimum. You might want to talk to a lawyer." I did exactly that. My attorney, George Matheson, had handled my property purchase and a few other matters over the years. He was a straight shooter in his late 50s with an office on Church Street. "They're bluffing," he said after reviewing the documents. "There's no easement. But here's the thing, they might try to claim adverse possession or some other legal theory. I'd recommend posting no trespassing signs clearly around that section of property, and if they show up to build, call the sheriff immediately." "What if they try to take me to court?" "Let them. You'll win. But be prepared for them to make your life difficult in the meantime." I spent the next day putting up signs. Big, official-looking no trespassing signs every 20 feet along the boundary. I also set up a trail camera near the road to monitor any activity. For 2 weeks, nothing happened. I started to think maybe Brenda had backed down. Then, on a cold Monday morning in early November, I checked the trail camera and found photos from the weekend. A crew had been out there, clearing the land. Trees had been cut, brush removed. They'd done a significant amount of work in preparing the site. I called George immediately. "They're doubling down," he said. "Get photos, document everything, and I'll file for an immediate injunction." I drove down to inspect the damage in person. It was worse than the trail camera had shown. They'd cleared about half an acre, created a gravel access road from Ridgeway Road, and had even poured a concrete foundation pad. This wasn't exploratory work. This was full-scale construction. My phone rang. "Brenda again." "I see you've noticed the progress on the salt facility," she said. "I hope you've reconsidered your position. We've already invested quite a bit of money, and the HOA board has voted unanimously to move forward." "Brenda, this is illegal. You're trespassing, you're building without permission, and I'm getting a court injunction." "Oh, Lucas, don't be dramatic. We have every right to be there. And honestly, if you take us to court, I have a dozen witnesses who will testify that you gave verbal permission months ago." "That's a lie." "Is it? Can you prove it? Think carefully about whether you want to drag this through the courts. It'll be expensive, time-consuming, and in the end, the facility will benefit you too. Why don't you just take the $500 and let it go?" I hung up on her this time. George filed the injunction that afternoon. We had a hearing scheduled for the following week. In the meantime, The judge issued a temporary restraining order preventing any further construction. I had copies of the order delivered to Brenda, the HOA board, and the construction company they'd hired. That weekend, I checked the trail camera again. They'd ignored the restraining order. A construction crew had been there Friday evening and all day Saturday, working by floodlight. The facility was now about 70% complete. It was a large pole barn structure with an open front and concrete walls on 3 sides, designed to hold several tons of road salt. I documented everything and sent it to George. They violated a court order. This is contempt. It's also going to make the judge very unsympathetic to their case, George replied. Let them keep digging their own grave. The hearing was on a Tuesday morning. I arrived at the courthouse with George, armed with photos, property records, and trail camera footage. Brenda showed up with 2 other HOA board members, a man named Richard Stern, and a woman named Patricia Holmes, along with their attorney, a slick-looking guy in an expensive suit named David Kowalski. Judge Margaret Sullivan was known for not tolerating nonsense. She was in her early 60s, had been on the bench for 20 years, and had a reputation for reading every document before a hearing. "Miss Patterson," she began, looking over her glasses at Brenda, "your association claims an easement over Mr. Barrett's property. I've reviewed the submitted documents, and I don't see any recorded easement." Kowalski stood. "Your Honor, the easement was part of the verbal understanding when the development was proposed. Mr. Barrett attended a town meeting where this was discussed." "A verbal understanding doesn't create a legal easement," Judge Sullivan said. "And Mr. Barrett's attendance at a town meeting doesn't constitute agreement." "Your Honor, if I may," Kowalski continued, "the HOA has acted in good faith, investing significant resources into this project based on their understanding of the property rights." "Good faith?" Judge Sullivan's eyebrows rose. "Mr. Matheson, do you have the trail camera footage?" George presented the evidence of construction continuing after the restraining order. The judge's expression grew increasingly stern as she reviewed it. "Miss Patterson, you violated a court order. That's contempt. But before I address that, let me be clear. You have no easement, no right to be on Mr. Barrett's property, and no right to build anything there. This facility must be removed immediately." Brenda stood up, her face red. "Your Honor, that's thousands of dollars of construction. We did this for the community. Mr. Barrett is being completely unreasonable about a tiny piece of land he doesn't even use." "Sit down, Miss Patterson," the judge said coldly. "Whether Mr. Barrett uses his land is irrelevant. It's his land. You've committed trespass, destruction of property, and contempt of court. I'm ordering the immediate removal of the structure at your expense. You have 30 days. Additionally, you'll pay Mr. Barrett's legal fees and damages to be determined. We'll have another hearing to address the contempt charge." It was a complete victory, but as we left the courthouse, George pulled me aside. "She's not going to let this go, be careful." He was right. Over the next week, I received 3 certified letters from Kowalski, each one threatening different legal actions. They were considering a lawsuit for the HOA's construction costs, claiming I'd somehow led them to believe they had permission. They were exploring eminent domain, arguing the salt facility served a public purpose. They were even suggesting they might file a complaint with the town about alleged code violations on my property. None of it had any legal merit, but it was designed to harass and intimidate. Then I got an idea. I called George. "What if we let them finish the facility?" "What, Lucas, we just won. They have to tear it down." "Hear me out. They haven't torn it down yet, right? The 30 days aren't up. What if I approach them with a proposal?" They can finish the facility and use it for the winter, but they have to pay me rent. Significant rent. They're not going to agree to that after the judge ordered them to remove it. They might. They've already invested all that money. Winter is coming. They want their salt storage. I could offer them a deal that saves face. George was quiet for a moment. What are you really planning? Let's just say I want to give them enough rope to hang themselves. I drafted a proposal. The HOA could complete the facility and use it for the current winter season. In exchange, they'd pay me $10,000 per month rent. They'd sign a formal lease agreement acknowledging the land was mine, and they'd agree to remove the facility at the end of winter at their own expense. Additionally, they'd pay my legal fees from the court case and $2,000 in damages for the trees they'd cut. I had George send it to Kowalski with a deadline of 3 days to respond. Brenda called me directly that evening, which I'd expected. "Lucas, this is extortion. $10,000 a month. It's a bargain considering you've already built the facility and you need it. Without it, where are you going to store salt? And if you don't agree, the judge's order stands and you have to tear it down anyway. We could store it at Richard's house. In his driveway. I'm sure the other HOA members would love that. Brenda, this is a fair offer. Take it or leave it. $5,000 a month. 10. Non-negotiable." She was quiet for a long moment. "We need to put it to a board vote. You have 3 days." The HOA board met that Thursday. I know because I drove past their community center and saw all the cars there. The meeting apparently got heated, with yelling audible from outside. On Friday morning, Kowalski sent over a signed lease agreement. I now had a signed document acknowledging my ownership of the property, acknowledging they had no easement, and committing them to $10,000 a month rent from November through March. $50,000 total. But that wasn't the real prize. I let them finish construction. By mid-November, the facility was complete. It was actually an impressive structure, well built and functional. The concrete pad was reinforced, the pole barn was sturdy, and they'd even installed drainage systems. Then they started filling it with salt. Dump trucks arrived throughout the last week of November, each one carrying tons of road salt. I watched through binoculars from my house as they stockpiled enough salt to handle the entire winter for all of Maple Ridge estates and the connecting roads. By December 1st, the facility was packed. They had at least 50 tons of salt in there, representing a significant investment. That's when I pulled the deed. I called George. "File a motion to enforce the lease agreement. They owe me the first month's rent by December 1st. Make sure it's clear that the lease specifies if they are late on payment. I have the right to terminate immediately and take possession of anything on the property." "You put that in the lease." I did. Standard landlord language. Kowalski should have caught it, but I buried it in the middle of a long paragraph about maintenance responsibilities. The rent was due December 1st. I waited. December 2nd came and went. No payment. December 3rd, still nothing. On December 4th, I had George send a notice of lease termination and a declaration that all materials on the property were now mine under the terms of the abandoned property clause. The phone call I received from Brenda that afternoon was something I'll treasure forever. "You can't do this," she screamed into the phone. "That salt cost us $40,000. You owed me rent. The lease was very clear about the consequences of non-payment. We were going to pay. The HOA treasurer was out of town. We just needed a few more days. The lease didn't provide for a grace period. You had an attorney review it. This is on you. You planned this. This was your intention all along. I offered you a fair lease, which you signed. You built a facility on my land without permission, ignored a court order, and now you've breached our agreement. The facility and everything in it now belongs to me. We'll sue you for everything you have. Please do. I'll see you in court with your signed lease agreement that clearly spells out the terms you've violated." She made some additional threats and accusations before I hung up. Over the next few days, I learned that the HOA's plan had been to delay the rent payment as long as possible, hoping I'd just accept late payments throughout the winter, and then refuse to pay the last month or two, forcing me into another court battle. Brenda had convinced the board they could string me along, and I'd eventually settle for less money just to avoid the hassle. It backfired spectacularly. By mid-December, I received a desperate letter from Kowalski offering to pay double the monthly rent if I'd reinstate the lease. I declined. Then they offered to let me keep all the salt but asked to use the facility, offering to pay me $15,000 a month. I declined. Finally, they offered to buy the facility and the acre of land for $200,000. I declined. The thing is, I actually could use that salt. I owned 100 acres, including a long private driveway and access roads throughout the property. I'd been paying a contractor to handle snow removal, and they charged me for salt as part of the service. Now, I had enough salt to last several winters. But more than that, I had something better: leverage. Because it turned out the HOA had promised their members a superior snow removal service as part of increased dues they'd approved the previous spring. They told everyone that the new salt facility would mean perfectly maintained roads all winter. Some people had moved to Maple Ridge specifically because of this promise. Without the salt, the HOA had to scramble to buy more at winter prices, which were significantly higher than the bulk price they'd gotten in November. And they had nowhere to store it except in a rented facility 15 miles away, which meant longer response times during storms. The first big snowstorm hit right before Christmas. 8 inches of heavy, wet snow. I watched the chaos unfold from my living room window. My section of Ridgeway Road, which I could now maintain myself using the salt facility on my land, was clear by 8 in the morning. The Maple Ridge Estates roads didn't get properly cleared until early afternoon, and even then, they were icy because the HOA hadn't been able to get enough salt. The complaints started immediately. I know because I started receiving calls from residents of Maple Ridge asking if they could pay me to maintain their roads. Apparently, Brenda had told everyone that I was the villain who'd stolen their salt, but many residents had done their homework and learned what really happened. One woman, Janet Morrison, called me on December 28th. "Mr. Barrett, I'm on the HOA board, or I was until I resigned yesterday. I wanted you to know that several of us had no idea what Brenda was doing. We thought you'd given permission for the facility. When we found out the truth, 5 of us resigned from the board. I appreciate you telling me that. There's something else. Brenda used HOA funds to pay for the construction without proper authorization. She claimed it was an emergency expenditure, but it should have required a vote of the full membership. Some people are talking about filing a complaint against her. That's between her and the HOA members. I understand, but I wanted you to know that not everyone supports what she did. And Mr. Barrett, thank you for the lesson in reading contracts. My husband's a lawyer, and he said that lease was a masterclass in protecting your interests while appearing generous." After she hung up, I felt a twinge of guilt. The regular residents hadn't done anything wrong. They'd trusted their HOA president to act in their interests, and she'd betrayed that trust. But I reminded myself that I'd offered a fair solution. They chose not to honor it. January brought more snow and more complaints about Maple Ridge's road maintenance. Brenda apparently tried to blame the service company they'd hired, but word had gotten out about the salt situation. Then, in late January, I got a call from a detective with the Burlington Police Department. "Mr. Barrett, this is Detective William Torres. I'm investigating some irregularities with the Maple Ridge Estates HOA finances. Your name has come up in connection with a lease agreement and a dispute over a salt storage facility. Would you be willing to meet with me?" We met at a diner in Burlington the next day. Detective Torres was in his early 40s, methodical and thorough. He had a folder full of documents. "I want to be clear. You're not under any suspicion," he said. "But I'm trying to piece together what happened, and I need your side of the story." I walked him through everything: the initial trespass, the court order, the contempt, and finally the lease agreement and its termination. "So they built on your land without permission, you took them to court, and then you offered them a lease?" he asked. "That's right." "And they violated the lease terms?" "Yes. The rent was due December 1st. They didn't pay." He made some notes. "Here's what we found. Miss Patterson allegedly misappropriated approximately $75,000 from the HOA reserve fund to build this facility. She did so without proper board approval, falsified meeting minutes to make it appear the board had voted when they hadn't, and failed to disclose to the board that there was no legal right to build on your land. I didn't know it was that extensive. We're still investigating, but it appears she may have also received kickbacks from the construction company. When the judge ordered the facility removed, she should have informed the board and arranged for its demolition. Instead, she entered into the lease agreement with you using more HOA funds, again without proper authorization. The board members signed the lease," I pointed out. 2 board members signed. Miss Patterson claimed to the construction company and the salt supplier that the full board had approved everything. She showed them documents that we now believe were falsified. The other board members say they never saw the actual lease agreement, just a summary that Miss Patterson provided. This was bigger than I'd realized. What happens now? We're building a case for embezzlement and fraud. The HOA membership has filed a formal complaint, and the Vermont Attorney General's office is involved because this affects an organization with regulatory oversight. Do you need anything from me? Just the documentation you have. Copies of all correspondence, the lease agreement, payment records, everything. I provided it all. George helped me organize it into a clear timeline. In February, Brenda Patterson was arrested. The charges included embezzlement, fraud, forgery, and perjury related to false statements she'd made in court filings. The local news covered it extensively, and it became a cautionary tale about HOA oversight and the importance of proper governance. Richard Stern and Patricia Holmes, the other 2 original board members who'd supported Brenda's actions, were named in a civil lawsuit by the HOA membership, but weren't charged criminally. The investigation found they'd been negligent but hadn't participated in the actual fraud. The new HOA board, led by a retired accountant named Thomas Willoughby, reached out to me in March. "Mr. Barrett, I know you have no reason to help us, but I wanted to extend an olive branch. The previous board acted shamefully, and you've been more than patient with us. Several of our members have suggested that if you're willing, we'd like to purchase salt from you for the remainder of the winter at a fair price." I considered it. I had more salt than I needed, and they were desperate. "I'll sell you salt at cost plus 10% for delivery. But I want a written agreement and I want payment up front." "That's more than fair. Thank you." We worked out a deal where they bought back about 30 tons of salt, which gave them enough to finish the winter. I made a modest profit and still had plenty left for my own needs. As for the facility itself, I decided to keep it. It was well built, and I could use it for equipment storage or even as a workshop. The HOA's lease required them to remove it at the end of winter, but I offered to waive that requirement if they paid me an additional $10,000. Thomas considered it. That's reasonable, but I need to put it to a membership vote. Given everything that's happened, I'm not making any decisions without full transparency. The membership voted to pay. They also voted to give me a formal written apology, which was delivered by Thomas himself. "We're trying to rebuild trust and be good neighbors," he said when he handed me the letter. "What Brenda did was inexcusable, and you had every right to protect your property. I hope we can start fresh." I appreciated the gesture. Brenda's trial was in June. I was called as a witness to testify about the trespass, the court proceedings, and the lease agreement. Her defense attorney tried to paint me as vindictive, someone who'd manipulated a vulnerable HOA for personal gain. The prosecutor destroyed that narrative with one simple question. "Mr. Barrett, at any point did you give Miss Patterson or the HOA permission to build on your land?" "No, never." "Did you initiate contact with the HOA about building a salt facility?" "No, they came to me after they'd already started construction." "And the lease agreement you offered, was that before or after the judge ordered the facility's removal?" "After." "I offered it as a way for them to avoid the cost of demolition while compensating me for the use of my land." "So you were actually trying to help them?" "I was trying to find a solution that worked for everyone." The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Brenda was found guilty on all counts. She was sentenced to 5 years in prison, though 3 were suspended, and she was ordered to repay the HOA the full amount she'd embezzled plus damages. The judge was particularly harsh about her contempt of court and the way she'd falsified documents. "You held a position of trust," Judge Sullivan said at sentencing. "The members of your community relied on you to act in their interests, and you betrayed that trust repeatedly. Your actions weren't just illegal, they were a fundamental violation of the responsibility you'd accepted as HOA president." I felt a mix of satisfaction and sadness watching her be led away. She'd brought all of this on herself, but it was still a dramatic fall from the self-righteous neighborhood enforcer she'd been just a year earlier. Life slowly returned to normal after that. The new HOA board operated with transparency and professionalism. They never bothered me about my property again, and we maintained a cordial, distant relationship. I did eventually join them for a community barbecue they held in July, mostly because Thomas personally invited me, and I felt it would be churlish to refuse. It was actually pleasant. Many of the residents thanked me for exposing the problems with their HOA and for being willing to work with the new board. One elderly woman, Mrs. Templeton, grabbed my hand as I was leaving. "My late husband always said that property rights are the foundation of freedom. Thank you for standing up for yours." That might have been the best compliment I received through the whole ordeal. The salt facility remained on my property, and I converted part of it into a woodworking shop. I'd always enjoyed carpentry as a hobby, and having a dedicated space with good lighting and ventilation was fantastic. The other section still stored salt, and I continued to handle my own winter road maintenance. Interestingly, my snow removal service became somewhat of a local legend. Several other property owners along Ridgeway Road asked if I'd be willing to maintain their sections too, for a fee. I declined mostly because I didn't want to turn a hobby into a business, but it was gratifying to know that my roads were better maintained than the HOA's had been. The following winter, Maple Ridge Estates had contracted with a professional service that did excellent work. Thomas made sure to tell me they'd learned their lesson about trying to handle complex services in-house without proper expertise. I ran into David Kowalski, Brenda's former attorney, at a coffee shop in Burlington about a year after everything concluded. He recognized me and came over to my table. "Mr. Barrett, I owe you an apology. I should have done better due diligence before taking Brenda's case. I trusted my client's representations about the property rights, and I missed the clause in the lease about abandoned property. That was sloppy lawyering on my part. I appreciated his honesty. We all make mistakes. How are you doing?" "Better. I've been more careful about vetting potential clients, and I actually use your lease as an example in a contracts class I teach at the community college. It's a perfect illustration of how important it is to read every word of an agreement. Glad something educational came out of it. Can I ask you something? Did you really plan the whole thing from the start, or did it evolve as you went along?" I thought about that. "A bit of both. I knew they were in the wrong, and I was angry about the trespass and the contempt of court. But the lease idea came to me as a way to turn their misconduct to my advantage. Once I realized they'd probably try to play games with the rent, I made sure the contract protected me. I didn't know Brenda was embezzling funds or that it would lead to criminal charges. That part surprised me." He nodded thoughtfully. "Well, it's certainly been a memorable case. Thank you for being gracious about it. George Matheson also benefited from the case in an unexpected way. He got several new clients who'd heard about how thoroughly he'd protected my interests. He joked that I should get a commission for the referrals. The trail camera I'd set up to monitor the construction remained in place, and it captured some interesting wildlife footage over the following months. I started a small YouTube channel posting the videos, which became surprisingly popular. Who knew that people loved watching foxes, deer, and the occasional moose wandering through Vermont countryside? Sarah at the county clerk's office also got some professional recognition. She documented everything so thoroughly that when the Vermont Bar Association did a seminar on property rights and HOA overreach, they used my case as an example, crediting Sarah's meticulous record, keeping as instrumental in establishing the clear chain of ownership. I kept all the paperwork from the case in a fireproof safe: the original deed, the survey documents, the court orders, the lease agreement, everything. George said it was a perfect example of why documentation matters. "You can't argue with paper," he told me. Everything was recorded, time-stamped, and verified. That's why you won so decisively. About 2 years after everything concluded, I got a letter from someone in California who'd read about my case online. She was dealing with a similar situation where her HOA was trying to claim part of her property for a community garden. She asked if I had any advice. I wrote back with a detailed letter explaining the importance of checking property records, documenting everything, understanding the law, and not backing down when you're in the right. I also emphasized the importance of having a good attorney who understands both property law and HOA regulations. She later wrote to thank me, telling me that my advice had helped her successfully defend her property rights. Her HOA had backed down once they realized she was serious and had documentation proving ownership. It felt good to help someone else navigate a similar situation. The Vermont state legislature actually ended up passing new laws about HOA oversight, partly in response to my case and several others that had come to light. The new regulations required annual independent audits for HOAs with budgets over a certain size, mandatory training for board members, and clearer procedures for expenditures and contracts. Thomas Willoughby invited me to testify when the bill was being considered. I drove to Montpelier and spent an afternoon explaining to a legislative committee what had happened and why better oversight was necessary. The vast majority of HOA board members are well-intentioned volunteers, I told them. But without proper checks and balances, it's too easy for someone like Brenda Patterson to abuse their authority. These new regulations will protect both homeowners and board members by creating clear guidelines and accountability. The bill passed unanimously. I occasionally saw former Maple Ridge residents around town. Most were friendly, some were apologetic, and a few seemed embarrassed about the whole situation. I never held any ill will toward the regular residents. They'd been victims of their own HOA president's misconduct, just as much as I'd been targeted by her overreach. One funny incident happened at a farmer's market in September. I was buying fresh corn when I heard a familiar voice behind me. I turned around to see Patricia Holmes, one of the former board members who'd supported Brenda. She froze when she saw me, then slowly approached. "Lucas, I know you probably don't want to talk to me, but I wanted to say I'm sorry. I should have questioned what Brenda was doing. I should have verified the property rights. I was lazy and I trusted her when I should have done my due diligence." "I appreciate you saying that, Patricia. I resigned from the board after everything came out. I felt terrible about my role in it. I've actually started volunteering with a nonprofit that helps educate HOA board members about their responsibilities. I'm trying to make sure what happened with us doesn't happen to other communities." That struck me as genuine redemption. "That's commendable. Sounds like you're turning a bad experience into something positive." "Trying to. Thank you for being decent about it." We chatted for a few more minutes, and I left feeling like maybe some people really do learn and grow from their mistakes. My relationship with Maple Ridge Estates eventually normalized to the point where I was invited to their annual community meetings as a neighbor, even though I wasn't a member. I attended occasionally, mostly to stay informed about anything that might affect my property. The new board was professional and respectful. They consulted me before making any decisions that could impact the shared road. They kept me informed about their winter maintenance schedule, and they never once suggested they had any rights to my property. Thomas Willoughby turned out to be an excellent HOA president. He instituted quarterly financial reports available to all members, created a system for soliciting resident input on major decisions, and built relationships with neighboring property owners like me to foster goodwill. "I learned a lot from what happened with you," he told me once. "The biggest lesson is that you catch more flies with honey than vinegar. Brenda's confrontational approach created enemies. I'd rather create partnerships." It was a smart philosophy, and Maple Ridge thrived under his leadership. The salt facility continued to serve me well. I eventually built a small addition to it where I stored my tractor and other equipment. It became the hub of my property maintenance operation, and I took pride in keeping it well organized and functional. Every time I walked into that building, I thought about the journey that led to me owning it. What started as an infuriating property rights violation had turned into one of the most satisfying victories of my life. I learned some valuable lessons through the experience. First, documentation is everything. The trail camera, the property records, the careful maintenance of correspondence, all of it was crucial. Second, knowing the law matters. I couldn't have protected my rights without understanding them. Third, patience can be a weapon. Letting them finish the facility and fill it with salt before pulling the rug out was infinitely more effective than just stopping the construction. But the most important lesson was about standing up for yourself. It would have been easier to just accept the $500 Brenda initially offered, or to settle for less than what I was entitled to, or to let them string me along with late payments. Taking the harder path, insisting on my rights, and following through despite the hassle and expense was difficult but necessary. George once asked me if I had any regrets about how I handled it. "Only one," I said. I wish I'd noticed the survey crew earlier and stopped them before they cut down those trees. They were beautiful old oaks. Could have been worse, he pointed out. At least you ended up with a useful building and enough salt to last a decade. He was right about that. The $40,000 worth of salt they'd left on my property was probably the most expensive mistake Brenda ever made, aside from the embezzlement that landed her in prison. I used that salt for years, and even when I eventually ran low, I was able to buy more at bulk prices because I had the storage facility. I also made sure to pay my property taxes scrupulously and on time, kept all my permits up to date, and maintained the facility in excellent condition. I didn't want to give anyone any excuse to claim I wasn't properly managing the property. The last I heard, Brenda had been released from prison after serving 2 years. She'd moved out of state, somewhere in Florida according to rumors. She never reached out to apologize, which didn't surprise me. Some people never accept responsibility for their actions. Richard Stern ended up moving away too. The civil judgment against him for his negligent oversight as a board member was significant, and I think the shame of what happened drove him out. I felt a bit bad about that, because he seemed like he'd genuinely been duped by Brenda rather than being malicious himself. But actions have consequences, and serving on an HOA board comes with real responsibilities. 5 years after everything started, I stood in my woodworking shop section of the former salt facility, building a custom bookshelf. The winter sun streamed through the windows, and I could hear the wind howling outside, but I was warm and comfortable. My phone buzzed with a text from Thomas. The message said, "Another successful winter of road maintenance. Thanks for your help with salt procurement advice. Maple Ridge is doing great." I smiled and texted back, "Glad to hear it. Good neighbors make life better." And that was the truth. The whole saga had been stressful and frustrating at times, but it led to positive changes. Better HOA oversight laws, a more professional board at Maple Ridge, a useful facility on my property, and a satisfying reminder that standing up for your rights matters. I finished the bookshelf that afternoon, loaded it into my truck, and drove it to Sarah at the county clerk's office. I'd built it as a thank you for all her help during the case. She was retiring after 35 years of public service, and I wanted her to have something to remember the case by. "Lucas, this is beautiful," she said, running her hand over the smooth wood. "You didn't have to do this. You helped me protect my property rights. It's the least I could do." She smiled, her eyes a bit misty. "You know what I'll remember most about your case? You never got mean or vindictive. You were firm about your rights, but you weren't cruel. That's rare these days." I thought about that on the drive home. She was right. I could have made things much harder for the HOA, could have demanded more money, could have refused to work with the new board at all. But that wasn't who I wanted to be. Justice and revenge aren't the same thing. I'd sought justice, protecting my property, holding people accountable for their actions, and ensuring it didn't happen to others. Revenge would have been about inflicting maximum pain regardless of fairness. The salt facility stood as a monument to the importance of that distinction. It was a building born from someone else's overreach and arrogance, transformed into something useful through patience, planning, and principle. Every winter, when I loaded salt into my truck to clear my roads, I thought about the absurdity of Brenda's original offer. $500 for the use of an acre of land, as if that made up for building without permission. She'd been so certain of her entitlement, so convinced that her position as HOA president gave her authority over my property. She'd been wrong, and that wrongness cost her everything: her position, her reputation, her freedom, and a significant amount of money. Meanwhile, I had my land, my rights, my salt facility, and the satisfaction of knowing I'd stood my ground. As I locked up the facility that evening and walked back up the hill to my house, I looked out over the 100 acres that I'd worked so hard to protect. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the snow-covered fields. Smoke rose from my chimney and lights glowed warmly in the windows. This was mine. Every acre, every tree, every building. I'd bought it fairly, maintained it responsibly, and defended it successfully. And somewhere in Florida, Brenda Patterson hopefully understood that you can't just take what isn't yours, no matter how convenient it might be or how certain you are that you're right. Property rights matter. Documentation matters. Standing up for yourself matters. And sometimes, the best revenge is simply ensuring that justice is served, and then moving on with your life, a little bit wiser and a lot more appreciative of what you have. The salt facility would stand for years to come, a permanent reminder of all those lessons. But it was also just a building, useful and functional, serving its purpose without drama or conflict, which was exactly how I liked it.